Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling a fascinating area you submitted, when equivalence, relations, and behavior. We're going to unpack some seriously intriguing research from a book called Relaciones de Equivalencia y Conducta by Andrés Garcia Garcia.
A fascinating choice. Garcia's work really digs into the heart of how we learn and make connections.
And you're the perfect person to help us navigate this. Now, I have to admit, even the chapter titles in this book had me hooked. Music calls us No Solo Equivalencia. It's not your average research paper. But before we get lost in the cool factor, let's start with the foundation. Can you give us a clear understanding of equivalence relations? What are we really talking about here?
At its core, it's about how our minds connect the dots, but in a very specific way. It's not just simple association like seeing fire and knowing it's hot. Equivalence relations are about these mental leaps our brains make to form new connections without being directly taught.
So it's more than just simple association, right?
Right. It's about relationships that emerge from existing knowledge.
Okay, so it's like our brains have this hidden superpower of deduction. Can you give us a real-world example to make this click?
Imagine learning a new language. You learn that the picture of a dog is associated with the spoken word perro, and then you connect perro to the written word perro. With equivalence relations, you don't have to learn every single connection from scratch. You automatically grasp that the picture of the dog is also connected to the written word perro. Even if you never explicitly learned that specific relationship, it just clicks because your brain understands these elements are part of an equivalence set.
So by learning a few core relationships, our brains essentially unlock a whole web of understanding. It's like a mental shortcut that can supercharge learning in all sorts of areas, right?
Absolutely. And what makes Garcia's work so captivating is that he doesn't just lay out the theory. He weaves in these fascinating glimpses into his own journey as a researcher, showing how personal experiences can shape scientific inquiry.
Right, like the fact that he grew up sharing a house with multiple families and started his academic journey fascinated by geography, not psychology. These details make his work feel more relatable.
And it underscores the interconnectedness of knowledge. It's like those seemingly random turns in life that somehow lead us to where we're supposed to be.
It reminds me of that saying, life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. But I digress. Let's delve into some of the core research questions Garcia tackles. One that really jumped out at me was this idea of the origin of equivalence relations. Is this ability uniquely human, or can other species tap into this mental power?
That's a question that's fascinated researchers for years. Garcia really dug into this, exploring the distinction between qualitative and quantitative differences between species. He argued that while humans might be more predisposed to forming equivalence relations, it doesn't necessarily mean other animals are incapable. His research with pigeons really challenged conventional thinking on this.
Wait, pigeons? You're telling me those birds we see in the park are secretly harboring hidden cognitive abilities? I need to hear more about this.
It might sound surprising, but his work with pigeons suggests that they might be capable of forming rudimentary equivalence-like relations, challenging the assumption that this ability is exclusive to humans. What he argued was crucial for this to happen was something he called own behavior discrimination, essentially the ability to be aware of your own actions within a learning process.
Okay, break this down for me. How does a pigeon being aware of its own behavior connect to this bigger idea of equivalence relations?
Imagine you're training a pigeon to peck a red key when it sees a horizontal line, and a green key for a vertical line. Now imagine the pigeon isn't just learning the association of lines and colors, it's becoming aware that when I see a horizontal line and I peck red, I get a reward. This added layer of self-awareness, this own behavior discrimination, might be a stepping stone towards those more complex equivalence relations.
So it's not just about learning a rule, it's about the pigeon understanding its role in the learning process, its own agency. That's amazing. Does he suggest how this own behavior discrimination develops? Or is it more about recognizing it as a factor?
That's a question he grapples with throughout his research. And it's this kind of questioning that makes his work so compelling. He doesn't have all the answers, but he's asking the right questions, pushing the boundaries of our understanding about how we learn and categorize information. And that leads us to another fascinating aspect of his work, this idea of the solo equivalencia, not only equivalence.
Intriguing. It sounds like there's more to the story than just forming neat and tidy equivalence classes. What other factors come into play?
Well, consider the concept of similarity. We often group things based on resemblance, even if they don't fit the strict definition of equivalence. For example, a lemon and a banana are both yellow, so they might be grouped mentally as yellow things. how they're very different fruits.
So are you saying that our brains sometimes prioritize simplicity over absolute accuracy?
Precisely. Garcia found that even with strong equivalence relations, those relationships could be overridden by these simpler, more readily apparent similarities.
It's like our brains are constantly weighing different factors, trying to figure out the most efficient way to organize the world around us, even if it means taking shortcuts. That's fascinating. But before we get too far down this road, let's pause here. We'll come back in part 2 to unpack more of Garcia's research. Welcome back to the deep dive. Last time we dove into the fascinating world of equivalence relations with the brilliant Andres Garcia as our guide.
We were talking about his idea that our brains love a good shortcut, like grouping a lemon and a banana just because they're both yellow,
Yeah.
even if they're very different fruits. He called this concept no solo equivalencia, not only equivalence.
Right, so it's about how our brains categorize the world. And sometimes those categories are based on these quick, almost instinctive similarities, rather than those more complex equivalence relations. What I found really interesting is that he didn't just leave it at that. He dug deeper to figure out how these different systems, similarity and equivalence, might interact, even compete with each other in our minds.
Absolutely. And his research showed that even when we've formed strong equivalence relations, those relations can be overshadowed by more obvious similarities, especially in new or uncertain situations.
So it's almost like our brains default to those simpler associations when they need to make quick judgments.
Exactly.
That's a fascinating insight for anyone who's ever struggled to break a bad habit or change a deeply ingrained belief.
It highlights the complexity of learning and behavior change, and it underscores the need to be mindful of how these different systems might be interacting, especially in educational settings.
It makes you wonder how teachers could leverage this knowledge to help students learn more effectively.
Imagine a teacher introducing a new concept. That might be counterintuitive or go against a student's existing assumptions. Knowing that similarity can sometimes trump equivalence, the teacher could present the new information in a way that minimizes those potentially competing similarities, making it easier for those equivalence relations to take hold.
That's fascinating. So it's almost like you're creating a mental space for those new connections to form by minimizing potential distractions. It's like weeding a garden to help the desired plants thrive.
Exactly. And this brings us to another crucial aspect of Garcia's work. His drive to not just understand equivalence relations, but to make them even more powerful, more efficient learning tools. He wasn't content with just mapping out the territory. He wanted to find the best routes, the shortcuts, if you will.
That's what I love about his approach. He was all about pushing the boundaries of what we know about learning, like his work on those compact procedures. Can you unpack that a bit for us? How do you speed up the process of forming those core equivalence relations?
Think about the traditional way of training equivalence relations. It often involves a multi-step process. You start with basic discriminations, like matching a picture to a word, and then gradually build upon those to form the more complex equivalence classes.
Right, it's like laying the foundation before you start building the walls.
Exactly. But what Garcia did was develop these compact procedures that streamlined that process, combining multiple steps into a single training phase.
So it's like you're giving the brain a blueprint, instead of having it figure out the architectural plans from scratch.
That's a great way to put it. And his research showed that these compact procedures were incredibly effective, dramatically reducing the time and effort required to establish those fundamental equivalence relationships. It's all about efficiency.
That's huge. I mean, if you can find ways to make learning faster and more effective, that has the potential to revolutionize education and beyond. But Garcia didn't stop there, did he? He also explored these correction procedures to refine the process even further.
You're right. He argued that the way we handle errors during learning is crucial. Traditionally, when someone gets an answer wrong, they might just move on to the next question without really addressing the mistake. But he believed that providing immediate corrective feedback, showing the correct answer, and giving a chance to practice could strengthen those equivalence relations.
It's like having a coach who not only points out when you've missed the mark, but also shows you the correct technique and gives you the opportunity to try again until you get it right.
And just like a good coach, these correction procedures proved to be incredibly effective. His research indicated that incorporating them led to faster learning, improved retention of information, and a deeper, more robust understanding of those equivalence relations.
That's a game changer. It's like taking a good learning strategy and turning it into a great one. It makes you wonder how much more effectively we could learn if we consistently applied these principles.
It's a question worth pondering. But for now, let's take a short break. When we return, we'll explore the most intriguing aspect of Garcia Garcia's work, how those mental connections, those equivalence relations, can impact our emotions.
And we're back. It's amazing how much ground we've covered in this deep dive into equivalence relations. We've gone from pigeons, pecking colored keys, to streamlining learning with compact procedures. But now, get ready to have your mind blown, because we're about to explore how these mental connections can actually influence our emotions.
Yeah, it's truly remarkable. Garcia was a firm believer that these mental frameworks don't just shape how we think, but also how we feel about the world around us.
Okay, so we're going beyond just linking concepts in our minds. We're talking about linking concepts to actual emotions. How does that even work?
Think about it this way. Imagine you have a phobia of spiders.
A common one, to be sure.
Now, let's say you learn that the word spider is equivalent to the word arachnid.
Okay, so far so good, but one's a little more scientific sounding.
Right. Garcia's research suggests that this newfound equivalence relation, this mental link between spider and arachnid, could actually transfer your fear response.
Yeah.
Suddenly, arachnid might make you just as uneasy as spider, even if you've never had a negative experience with that specific word.
Wow, that's both fascinating and a little unsettling. So just by creating a mental connection between two things, you could potentially transfer an emotional response.
You've got it. And this opens up a whole new understanding of how phobias, anxieties, even preferences might develop, and potentially even be treated.
So are you suggesting we could use equivalence relations therapeutically? Could we counter a negative emotional response by linking it to something positive?
That was Garcia's thinking precisely. It's like rewiring those emotional circuits in our brains by strategically forming new connections. And he didn't just theorize about it, he put it to the test.
What did he find? Did it actually work?
In some cases, yes. His experiments show that by transferring positive emotional associations through equivalence relations, you could potentially reduce negative reactions. It's not a magic bullet, but it presents a fascinating avenue for understanding how our thoughts, feelings, and this intricate web of mental connections all intertwine.
It really highlights the incredible adaptability of our brains and the potential we have to reshape our understanding of the world and our experiences within it.
It's a powerful reminder that we are not simply at the mercy of our emotions. Through learning, through conscious effort, we can shape those responses in profound ways.
This has been an incredible journey. We've gone from the foundational principles of equivalence relations to the profound ways they can impact our emotional lives, all thanks to the groundbreaking work of Andres Garcia Garcia.
He was a true pioneer in exploring the intricacies of the human mind. His research reminds us that even the most complex processes like learning and emotion can often be traced back to these fundamental mechanisms of how we connect the dots in our minds.
And speaking of connecting the dots, I have to say, one of the biggest takeaways for me has been this idea of own behavior discrimination. It's stuck with me throughout this whole deep dive.
It is a powerful concept, this idea that our awareness of our own actions, our own role in the learning process, might be a key factor in developing those higher-order thinking skills.
It makes me wonder how much more we could achieve, how much more effectively we could learn and grow if we all cultivated a greater sense of own behavior discrimination in our lives, if we were more mindful of our actions, more aware of the impact our choices have on our thoughts and feelings. Well, that's something to ponder, isn't it? And on that note, I want to thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a fascinating exploration, and I hope you've all learned something new and thought-provoking today. Until next time, keep those minds curious.